Hey there, welcome back to the Philanthropy Mastermind series. I am your host, Jay Frost. And fortunately for you, you won't be hearing a lot from me today because we have this exceptional guest in the program who I'll have the privilege of introducing to you in a second. He's probably going to be coming on his camera any second now, too. And that is Mark Egge. But before I do that, I want to welcome you and, of course, give a shout out to the sponsor of the series, DonorSearch. You also won't be hearing much about them unless our guest mentions them to you in the course of his conversation with you. But DonorSearch is not only a terrific company for understanding who your donors are, where they come from, both your current donors and perhaps your future ones, but also they've been sponsoring this series since 2016, well over 500 programs. We stopped counting a while ago now, of podcasts, conversations, and webinars for CFRE credit. There's a lot of content in today's, and my only regret is that we didn't submit it for CFRE credit, but don't go away because you're going to want to learn all of that content today. We're talking about connecting data to strategy, 2 case studies, and this is going to be information rich because of our guest, who is, of course, Mark Egge, who, among other things, of course, is the principal at Itasca Partners, his firm. And previously, he's been the AVP at Hamline University, Senior Manager Prospect Development at Greater Twin Cities United Way, and Director of Prospect Research at Carleton College. And for those of you who follow my passion, and I hope your passion for the world of APRA, all the people in prospect development and research, you probably also know that Mark was president of APRA previously, in addition to president of his chapter prior to that. So it's great to follow up the APRA conference with a deep dive into a really important subject with a person who knows it better than maybe just about anybody else, and that is Mark Egge. So Mark, thank you very much for hanging out with us today. It was really a pleasure to have you.
Hey Jay, yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for that great warm introduction. I appreciate it. It's really fun to be back on the Mastermind series. It's been a while, so yeah, I'm really excited to talk with you all today. It's totally fine that there's not a CFRE piece to this because it's mostly bad jokes. So you know, it's okay. So all right, well, with that, should I just fire up the engines and go? Are we ready?
Yes. And as you're firing up those engines, I will take myself off screen so you can talk freely with folks. But I will be in the background monitoring the chat and the Q&A so that we can share those with you afterwards. Of course, Mark, you're welcome to look at those if you want, but we'll be looking at those throughout and then bring those to you at the end. In addition, we also have Jack, our producer, who'll be following along and looking at those portals and also making sure that everything is coming through clearly to you. So if you see any interruption in audio or visual, please let us know. But most importantly, use the chat as a conversation tool and use the Q&A throughout. We want your questions and we will have those answered. So Mark, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Jay. Well, welcome everyone. Great to know that you're existing. I can't see you, but here we are in the universe of virtual presenting. I'm gonna have to say that the music to start off with was delightful to have the stereo sound. And welcome to WJF Radio, home of smooth philanthropy. So that was great. But seriously, it's really good to be here. I really appreciate the invitation, and I'm excited to talk with y'all. So let me just jump right in here. I'm going to start my screen share. We should be able to see my big old slide there, connecting data to strategy. All right, looks like we're good to go. All right, let me switch controls real quick. Yeah, so I just wanted to talk through a couple of case studies that I was particularly proud of in a past life, essentially, and show you kind of how that worked out for us and what that looked like. I'm very passionate about data and strategy, and when people ask me, what are you trying to do with your business right now, Mark? I say I'm really loving connecting data to strategy and finding ways to communicate, and so that's a big piece of what I'm doing. So let's talk through that. Jay mentioned my background a little bit. I've been doing this for about 18 years, a lot of involvement with APRA, and I do want to put that plug in for APRA. If you're not a member, if you haven't engaged with any of their resources or conferences or anything, please go check it out. Fantastic professional organization. Can't say enough about it. And right now I'm with Itasca Partners, which is my solo firm. This is our website, itascapartners.com. Look at the beautiful landscape. Isn't that pretty? Amazing. But today I want to talk about data and strategy, particularly when I was at Hamline University. My last sort of in-house role in fundraising was at Hamline, where I was the associate vice president for development. Officially, I was overseeing annual giving and operations, but I had a really key role there in terms of partnering with the VP, my boss, on strategy and really leveraging data to guide that strategy. So that's I think a piece of that job that I really loved, and there's a few case studies here that we'll talk about. To quickly describe what they are before we jump right in, one had to do with staffing and resources and where we're going to, make a bid for, okay, here's what we need and why. And the other has to do with our campaign goal. So I'll get into those right away here now. So let's start with the staffing issue. This was something where, it ultimately turned into, how do we say, here's what we need and why? But the process of getting there was really an iterative process of working through a series of questions. And I think the first question that really kind of kicked it off, which is top of mind for anyone in a leadership position, is, so how are we doing? You want to know, how are things going? And data is great for that, right? So at this point, when we were talking about this, we were looking at total raised and saying, how is our total fundraising going in terms of our unrestricted current use dollars, right? The money in the door that we can use today to pay the bills. We're not talking about pledges, we're not talking about planned gifts, but in terms of just like annual fundraising dollars, what's that looking like? All signs are go here. They're looking great. We're on an upward trajectory after a little downturn, several years before we started. My boss started at the beginning of fiscal 2019. I started shortly thereafter. So that context is sort of a line in the sand there, so you understand what's going on. As you can see, we made a huge difference in that 1 year. We came in 2019 and shot things through the roof in 2020. That's not how it works. There's a little more nuance than that, obviously. The other piece here that we wanted to look at, though, was, all right, we're doing pretty well on dollars. What do donors look like? Donors were not looking good. I've overlaid sort of our donor count over the same time period and got the scales adjusted left to right there, so you can see how those things are going on. We're not doing great with donors. Those numbers are going down pretty dramatically. And yet our total raised dollars are going up pretty nicely. So obviously what's going on there? Well, the average gift per donor has increased dramatically from 667 per donor to 1,500 by 2020, right? In theory, just a higher average gift is great, but not when you're just losing a lot of donors. So we knew that we had to dig in a little bit more and understand what's going on. We can get into a really sort of, did your eyes just go blurry when I pulled that up? This is what sometimes when we put together data, you throw a big pivot table chart in there and it's like, here, look. You can't see anything with this really, and you have to take a lot of mental energy to dig in and see what's going on. But this was critical for us to figure out what is going on here. This chart, real quickly, the explanation is that if we take each of the households within our donor base and say how much did they give within a fiscal year, if they gave 10,000 or more, they're in that top row there of 10K plus, down to the 5 to 10K, down to the 2,500 to 5,000, right? And this is the total that we're getting from each of those households within that group from 2015 to 2020, right? So just looking at this, it's kind of hard to tell. I love Excel, and don't get me started about any sort of data analysis tools. I can talk your ear off about any of them that I know well. Excel is one of them. I really love Excel's Spark lines. If you haven't played with those, they are very fun. They're like little chartlets, just little tiny charts for your data. The nice thing about Spark lines is you can just get a quick snapshot of what's going on here with a very slim piece of data, right? So in this case, I go, let me look at each of these rows across and see the trend for those, what's going on with them. And so you can look and see very quickly which lines are going up, which lines are going down. What does that look like? The 10K and 5K gifts, those are both on the upswing. The 2,500 to 5,000 is kind of, all over the place. But obviously, when we say, okay, donor count is going down, total giving is going up, yes, we're going to see more gifts at that high end, and at the low end gifts, those are going to be dropping. And in fact, we're seeing that drop pretty dramatically here. So when we're looking at this, we go, oh yes, of course, we're seeing less dollars from these people. Those lines are all slanted down. Down is bad. This is one of the nice things about data visualization is we can summarize things that, as you can see, the trend here is blah, 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 blah. I can just say down bad. People know what I'm talking about, right? So down bad, we understand that. That's just the dollars that are coming from each of those groups. I also wanted to look at, well, let's just see the counts. Here's the counts within each of those. So how many households are giving at different levels. Again, got the spark lines here to show that. You can see that a little bit. Conditional formatting, another great friend of mine to help things really pop for us. When we use that, it helps us show things even more dramatically. And you can see here, red bad, particularly at the low end. Now you remember, I said my boss started in fiscal 2019. I was shortly thereafter. That's not looking great for us when we look at this chart in terms of lower end donors. But as we're going, okay, what's really going on here? Where do we need to focus? Clearly, the lower end of the gift table here, those gifts are where we needed to be focusing our time and energy. On the major gift front, we're doing great, right? Like lots of green up at the top end. At the bottom part, not so much, right? So the play in terms of where we need to make an investment is at that lower end. And for us, that meant a staffing question. But we needed to be able to make that case with this information. Now, I highlight that and say, these aren't real great. You put someone like my boss in that position where he goes, hey, remember that time I got here and things have been going great? And that's not what we can say here. We go, no, this is very bad. So we actually wanted to find a way to present this particular case, this particular problem, in a way that would be a little more flattering to us or less alarming, essentially. So I said, we have this in our back pocket if we need to dig in further with someone. But when we go to the great budget tribunal within the institution, whatever that's going to look like, I said, let's find a different way to present this that isn't so alarming necessarily. Because remember, from a dollars perspective, we're okay. Not flattering, red bad. So what I decided to do is say, all right, let's take a look at that, just the share of revenue of the total raise by gift level, right? The red bar here is that 10,000 and up giving level. This, up good, right? Putting it in the very simple terminology, excuse me. This doesn't look terrible, right? Because, hey, we're seeing more and more of our giving coming from $10,000 and up donors. So we're able to say, hey, don't be alarmed, but look at the top part, it's getting pinched, right? And it's a bit more positively oriented way to say that a higher percentage of our total is coming from our largest donors. We went from 51% to 85%. There's huge risk in this space, and so our play was to say, look, we want to expand the top part of the bar too, so that increases. We'll keep the red, going up as well, and we will go beyond the 100% mark with our total giving, which any of you who understand statistics know you can't go beyond that. But our brains don't necessarily think that quickly or need to figure that out. This ultimately ended up being what we used to show, hey, there's an issue here that we need to resolve, and this pinched part up at the top here is really what we need to resolve. And the way that our play to do that, what we need to lobby for was more staff. The question though is, how do we show that we're not throwing good money after bad? How do we show that we're not, basically burning $100 bills? Which I don't know who burns $100 bills for a piece of an image like that, but that's some serious investment to providing sellable images for presentations like this. But anyway, that's not my problem. That's not my money. I just borrowed the image. 3 words: ROI, the return on investment. This was the play that I knew we needed to make to be able to make the case for what we were doing. And so that's where we ended up going with this. It's not a terribly difficult process to go through to demonstrate this, but it takes a little bit of work, and I don't think we do it enough. This particular idea came from a colleague of mine who's a VP at another university. She said, yeah, we're just not really talking about this a lot in terms of the dollars spent and how much we're getting out of that. And when you're in advancement, it's, that's kind of easy to make that case, or easy to put that math together and show it. Obviously, there's nuance to it, but it's a great thing to be able to show. And so I said, we need to do that here to show that there really is a return on what we're doing here. The fundraising return on investment, real simple here, right? We're just looking at how much do we spend all up for our fundraising operations and what we're doing, how much do we raise, and then doing the math on that to say, here's what our return is on that. It's just a good exercise to understand, but can also be powerful when you're trying to make a case for what you're doing in your program. For us, we were looking at, for expenses, we're going, all right, what's all of our staffing in terms of frontline fundraising staff, major gifts, annual giving, our operations people from gift entry to database to research stewardship, all of the pieces of the ecosystem. A person could also look at marketing communications, alumni relations if you're in higher education. Those pieces may be related. For our analysis, what we were trying to do, we decided not to include those. But then in addition to all of those staffing expenses, there's the operating expenses. How much are we paying for our database, paper every year, technology, all those sorts of things. Roll all that stuff in and say, this is the totality of what it takes for us to do what we're doing here. And then on the flip side, what we're raising, for us, we were just looking at new cash and new pledges and also planned gifts. Chose not to include grants. A person could if they're trying to do this analysis on their own. Grants are kind of a different animal though. I like to kind of think about this, how much are we raising in terms of how much do we actually have control over, like significant control. Grants kind of are on the fence, if funders are drying up, or if we're applying for really competitive grants, maybe we don't have as much control in that space. Person could go either way. In our case, we had one person in grants and sponsored programs. He wasn't part of this analysis, so I said, let's leave that out. We don't need to include that piece. We did include planned gifts because we were in a campaign. I'm like, well, this is part of what matters to us, is how much we're raising for our campaign, and planned gifts were part of that. But we did not include realized bequests because they rely on the right people dying, which is really morbid, really sick. And we may have control over the piece of whether or not someone puts us into their estate plans, but whether or not we actually see that money come in has to do with whether or not they die, which is not a great fundraising approach. So, and also, we had a few years where part of our revenue that came in terms of unrestricted dollars was realized bequests that were not designated in any way, shape, or form. But I said we can't include those because we don't influence those. So I don't want that to be part of our return on the investment. But when we add up all these pieces, that's how we get to that number. And so for us, starting with the dollars raised, I said, all right, let's just put a line in the sand from when you started bots and we got here, and that's the right-hand side of the chart here, and the left-hand side of the chart is the years prior, right? Is it self-serving for us to put that line in the sand there? Maybe a little bit. No comment about that. But at the very least, we're showing like, hey, before us, here's kind of what the average was looking like. Once we got here, here's what the average looked like. We had a good year in fiscal 19 in terms of fundraising. There was a lot of stuff that was ready to come in that we got across the finish line, essentially. But even so, years fiscal 20 and fiscal 21 were both better than the average for fiscal 16 through 18, right? So number one, showing, yeah, we're raising more money. Because it'd be one thing if we were to say, oh yeah, our return is high, but it's only because we slashed expenses and and kept up with revenue in that sort of a way. Right? So in this case, the first piece was showing, yeah, we're raising more money, so that's valuable right there in and of itself. So that was the on the dollars raised side. Right, again, total new gifts and commitments secured, excluding realized estate gifts, excluding grants. We made sure to annotate all this so that there weren't any questions. And looking at the expenses side, again, with the same cut point, went from averaging 1.3 million to 1.2 million, and this is all those expenses I mentioned before. General downward trend. The university, like a lot of places in higher education, was continually looking at how do we tighten our budget, how do we, be more efficient with our spending, and so there was a little bit of a downward trend overall for across the university, and fundraising was not immune to that necessarily. So these are the two pieces of the puzzle, right? And as I mentioned before, how we calculate that is basically dollars raised divided by expenses equals your ROI. So how'd that look for us? Well, when we do the same layout, fiscal 18 and prior, fiscal 19 and after, beforehand, it was about $5 raised per dollar spent on fundraising expenses. Since the time we've gotten there, it was more like $8. So I don't know if you all know a lot about investment. I know just enough to be dangerous. If I'm getting $2 back for every dollar I invest, that's amazing, right? But to get $5 back, which is the lower side here, that's fantastic. But we were at a point where we were at more like $8. And let's say we throw out the outlier of fiscal 19, right? Let's say we take that out. Even so, we're still averaging $7 between fiscal 20, fiscal 21, right? So that was a powerful piece to be able to say, number one, investing in advancement is a wise investment. You're going to get a great return from that. The second part, though, we are an extra good investment. We're the goodest, because you can see that we're doing an even better return on before. Anytime anyone can do this kind of analysis with their own shop and what they're doing, it helps them get a sense of like, okay, are we valuable to what's going on here at the organization? And it helps basically it's an existential supporter, right? Saying it matters that we're here, what we're doing is valuable, this is beneficial for the organization. Even the worst year among these for return, fiscal 16 there, we were just north of $2, so $2.30 for every dollar returned. I don't know about you, but I would happily take my retirement account, and if someone said, hey, for every dollar you invest this year, you're going to get $2.30 back, I go, yes, please, I'm in. So even in our worst year in terms of return, it was still really fantastic. So from an investment perspective, can't be beat, right? The question of like what happened with that, unfortunately, we did not secure the resources we wanted to. Apparently, the case wasn't made strong enough. No, I take that back. I think we made a really strong case. It was really fantastic. But the issue was that there were other factors at play. There's always politics. There's always issues of like, what are the other revenue sources the university is looking at? And in fact, in our setting, enrollment revenue was much higher than fundraising revenue. And so that was a place where we said, there's going to be a bigger bang for our buck there. And so that was where more of the dollars went. But I felt really good about the analysis we did, both in terms of identifying what do we need to do, where do we need to focus, and then making the case for this is why this is a good investment. I stand by our analysis. That's great. Fantastic. Moving on to the second case study. Let's talk a little bit about campaign goal setting situation here. And just Jay and Jack running the Zoom meeting here, FYI, I cannot see anything in the Zoom, and that's fine with me. If you need to interrupt me, please do so auditorily, because I'm just looking at my stuff, so thanks. I'm going to keep plowing ahead, though, given that I'm not getting any audio feedback at all. Super. All right, let's talk about the campaign goal setting at Hamlin. Let's talk about that. There we go. So when I got to Hamlin, we were about 3.5, 4 years into a comprehensive campaign, very much in the silent phase, but there had been some leadership transition beforehand, and so we weren't fully underway. So the question at that point was really, what is our goal going to be, and how long is this campaign going to be? We had a campaign committee, things were moving in that direction. We were in a position where we're going, all right, what have we done before? What should we do now? The campaign committee had been talking about this and trying to get this figured out. Some context, the prior campaign ran from 1994 to 2006. It was a sesquicentennial. There is a $3 word if I've ever heard one. It basically means 150-year anniversary. So for that campaign, they started off with a $100 million goal. They surpassed that in 2002. The sesquicentennial was officially in 2004. I'll have you know, Hamlin University is Minnesota's first university, founded in 1854. So 2004 was that 150-year anniversary. 2 years prior to that, they said, well, we're doing great with our fundraising. Let's up the goal to 150. Isn't that a beautiful parity between the number of years we've been around and the size of our campaign goal? I put, the campaign ended in 2006, sort of, because I think that's when they crossed the finish line. It dragged on for a bit because that's hard to increase your goal by 50% and say, we're going to do that in 2 years. So a little bit of a stretch. But the context that the campaign committee is working with is going, we did 150 million last time. We should go bigger this time. Okay, well, by 2019, I get there. And we're saying, all right, we want to do bigger than $150 million. We're at 50 million raised by about year 4 here. And you really want to go bigger. We have to go bigger. There were a lot of factors influencing the decision making here, but data wasn't playing a key role there. And as my boss and I were talking about it, I said, I think we need to find one more way to kind of put this to bed, basically. There was a feasibility that had been done that said, yeah, we can see your way to about 100 million. When we looked at our total rated prospect capacity, we're just over 100 million. Both of these numbers, if you know anything about math, these numbers are less than 150 million. So that's not great. We said we got to find some way to kind of drive this home, finish it off. Going beyond the information that we had, I said, let's do an external analysis, right? So let's look at what other schools have done, what might be possible within the realm of higher education what could this look like? And so that ended up being sort of the project that I undertook here to try and make that case. The question that I had really was, okay, we know how much we've been raising before our campaign here. We can look at that for other institutions. So there's, let's call it 3 years, 3 years of pre-campaign fundraising. And then there's a goal amount that we want to set. We can look and see other institutions, they've got their pre-campaign fundraising, they've got a campaign goal. Is there a relationship between those two numbers, right? Is there a connection? Can we say, yeah, these are actually pretty closely related somehow? Intuitively, we go, yeah, I think so. The question is, what's the math, and do we really know from a statistical perspective whether or not that's the case? Yes, there is. I'm done. Great, thanks. No, I'll explain that a little bit more here. So this chart, it's a little faded out. I apologize. You will get the slides later on. We'll send that along. This is a dot plot that shows about 50 institutions. I grabbed a bunch of data from saying, all right, let's look at their campaign goal. Let's look at how much they raised in the 3 years preceding their campaign. Just 3 years to kind of smooth things out a little bit so we don't just have anomaly years of the year immediate prior. So something kind of smooth it out there. On the left to right axis, the x-axis, that shows, what was their total 3 years giving. So for example, organizations far to the right had, much higher, and then organizations to the left, much lower. You know how charts work. And then on the y-axis, the vertical piece, what was their goal amount? Now this had to be normalized across the different campaigns because some of them were 5 years, some are 8 years. So we said, let's just take the campaign goal amount, divide it by the number of years, and that will be, the other figure in here. So this is all kind of normalized. We plotted this all out. If you blur your eyes a little bit, you can already see there's a little bit of a trend with these dots going from lower left to upper right, right? So we're going, I think there's a relationship. There's actually a thin gray line in there that is a trend line. And when we did the math on that to say, all right, this is telling us what that relationship looks like. The p-value in there is less than 0.0001 and the r-squared value of 0.91. Stats nerds know, ooh, that's really good. That's a really strong relationship. The rest of you, take my word for it. It's a conspicuously strong relationship. So we knew we could work with that particular insight and go, yep, we can use this. There's a good relationship there. That relationship is essentially a multiplier in the math to figure out what a campaign total could be, right? So we can take our 3-year campaign total, times this multiplier, times our campaign length. That could be our goal, right? So we could look at some scenarios here. What I wanted to do was to show people on the campaign committee who are making the decision what this can look like. How do we arrive at this number so we can really put this to bed? So I'm going to switch screens real quick here and show you the Tableau workbook that we use to share that information. All right. Should see a white screen with gray tiles at the top. It looks like it's screen sharing appropriately. If not, someone can shout at me. That's great. I'll send a link to this particular visualization. This is something I did in Tableau. It's available as a downloadable Tableau workbook. It's on Tableau Public. And the information is all taken from generally publicly available resources. The sites are linked at the bottom here, which you can't see on your screen, but trust me, they're valid links. You'll be able to see that when this goes out. But there was a bunch of text here. I include this for people who are just jumping into the spreadsheet or to the worksheet to begin with. This explains how this all works in terms of the multiple and all that, right? As I mentioned, we wanted to see what the relationship was, and as I was talking with these campaign committee members, I wanted to be able to say, yep, there's clearly a relationship, and that holds even if we go down to smaller campaign sizes. Like if we go in the same neighborhood as us, smaller campaigns where the 3 years leading up, closer to our range, essentially. We'll get into that in just a minute. But even in this space, we've got a strong relationship there, clear line. There's a clear trend going from lower left to upper right. You can see that that's there. So we're going, this is valid. We're great. We needed to look at what is our school doing. I got Hamlin selected here in terms of the 3 years leading up. I want a 3-year average. This is each of the annual years here. Wanted to be able to show, all right, well, let's just add those up on the right and see what that looks like. So if I say, all right, so 2017, the 3 years leading up to that is 7.4, 2.7, 2.2, 2.4. That gets us to that 7.4, right? We were ultimately in a place where we were trying to decide, make a decision about our campaign actually really leaning into the campaign, fully doing a campaign. We were making that decision in 2019. So the year prior, the 3 years leading up, I'm going, all right, let's call that this 2018 here, and we're going to use the number of 7.6 million. So that's what we're going to use in our calculations. I move my little line there, we can see that there. Keep that number in mind here, 7.6 million for 3 years. I showed a little bit on the dot plot, like how do we narrow down the schools we're dealing with? My concern is, does this average vary by school size? Do we want to get a sense of like, okay, what's the range that we're actually dealing with? So I'll bring this down a little bit. We said 7.6 million for our school that we're looking at. I'll put this to 30 or so. Actually, we'll go 15. Nope, another 0. The average among these multipliers is 2.3, but we've got a few that are kind of outliers that are jumping a bit. 4.6 over here, 0.9. I might shade that down a little bit. Let's just call it 2, right? But they're all within a range here in terms of what the multiplier number is. Now we can use that to play around. Before I do that, guys, this is my baby. This chart is not helpful to the analysis that we're trying to do here, but it's a trellis chart. It's really cool. It's just fun to look at. You can get a sense of each of these different schools within the data set. What was their annual fundraising looking like before the campaign, and then once they got in, what did that look like? The green sections here show you each of their campaigns. This is just, it's fun to play with and poke around and say, oh, what does this all look like? I should have taken it out, but I'm too vain. It was too much fun to put together. So you'll be able to play with that if you download the workbook here that you can use in Tableau Public. I'll move on. So ridiculous. You'll remember that we mentioned our sum of the 3 years pre-campaign was 7.6 million. And we set a multiplier of 2. When we use an 8-year campaign length, that gets us to 120 million. Now, remembering our feasibility study put us just below 100 million. Our prospect base said just above 100 million. This is saying, well, you might be able to get to 120. Are we really having a full 8-year campaign? I don't know. I'm not necessarily sure if we say, well, it's really a 5-year campaign because we'll go, starting in earnest. So this is a piece that it led to some interesting discussions with the committee members to say, what does it really mean for us to be in a campaign? But to say, it looks like it's this range. It looks like it's from about, we're going to be 6 to 8 years. Let's say we do a full 8 years. We're looking at cap out at 120. Working through this, being able to show the different examples to the committee was really valuable and actually helped us kind of put a nail in the coffin of that conversation and say, we need to decide, this is what we're doing, this is how we think we can get there. And so this particular tool was, a helpful tool to be able to show people and let them play around on their own. It was kind of a fun thing to put together, honestly, too. Let me flip back to my presentation and continue there. But that was essentially the tool that we were using for that conversation. So what happened? Well, here we have a skeptical board member. This we had one member of the board, of the committee, excuse me, skeptical committee member. He was a huge numbers guy, really smart. He worked in finance, very skeptical, wanted logic and reason behind everything. This analysis ultimately convinced him that this was the way we should go, and he was influential with the board. You see how this guy is smiling now? Thank you, AI, for giving me both the skeptical guy and the smiling guy. But when we got that smile on his face, he felt good about where we were going. He had a lot of credibility with a lot of the other members of the committee. So from a political perspective, my boss gained a lot of he got a lot of capital with this, essentially. So this was super valuable from that perspective and worked out in our favor. Ultimately, we set a goal of 110 million and to a stretch of 130 million and saying, all right, well, the official campaign will be 8 years ending June 30th of 2023, which if you're looking at your calendar, that is in our past. Happy to report they just crossed the 110 million mark in August. They did extend the campaign through December. There were a few things that slowed us down. I think had those things not happened, like a global pandemic, like being in the news for whatever reason. No, I'm not talking about that. We maybe would have got well beyond the 110 and closer to the 130 mark. But I felt really good about the analysis and where we landed with it as a result. There we go. Those are the two cases that I wanted to showcase, that were pretty beneficial for us. Fun projects. So we're taking a lot of data that could be very confusing, very overwhelming, very frustrating to work with, and we're able to take it and display it, present it in a way that was really compelling and really made the case for us in a way that's beneficial. I do have time for questions. I'm going to see.
And there are plenty.
Lovely.
And there may be more. I don't. So first of all, it was awesome, and I know people were enjoying the whole thing, from the chartlets at the beginning to everything you were saying at the end, and you were getting a lot of truly fan-like comments here from people just talking about the trellis charts and so forth. So let me see if I can pull those back up, because for some reason you just disappeared on me. So Jack, you may need to see if you can pull those questions up, because my visuals have failed for the moment.
I'm sorry, what do you need me to pull?
Why don't you share the first question with Mark, because my visuals have failed. I'll be right back with you.
Okay. The first one is from Carrie Sorensen. It's, when you're in a campaign and needing those larger gifts in the shorter term, how do you make the case for the smaller gifts too?
That's a great question, right? Like, in terms of dollar goals and what we're going to do in terms of getting to a particular point within the campaign, the big gifts add up quicker, right? So if all we're prioritizing is money, then the bigger gifts are really all that matters. When you look at a more long-term, holistic fundraising strategy and approach, we know that the only way to sustain your fundraising long-term is to continue to increase and maintain your donor base, right? So that was part of the play there that we had to make, part of the case we had to make. In my experience, working on the campaigns that I've worked on, those very, very top of the pyramid gifts, typically whatever campaign you had prior, immediately prior, is going to dictate what's going to happen in the next campaign. That is to say, your top lead gift of 20% of your campaign total, let's say, let's call it $20 million gift. That person probably was a $1 million donor at your last comprehensive campaign. I've literally seen this in the case where it was a $50 million donor. They were 1 million the campaign prior. Campaign prior to that, they were 50,000. Campaign prior to that, they were just, I think, 500 or something like that. Right? So the base matters, and making sure that we're engaging that space really matters, because that's where your future growth comes from. So that's, for us, how we try to make that case. And when we're saying, like, it ultimately comes down to the willingness of the institution to invest in the long-term sustainability. If you've got a leader who is only thinking about what's happening right now, what the current bills are, I get it, that's a situation that you have to deal with, and so you have to just get the money in the door. But when you say what's going to set us up for success long-term, the expanded donor base really, really matters. And that's one of the things that, seeing that donor count go down was really tough. Those mid-level, lower-level gifts can be more staff and time intensive, and it can be hard to make the case for that because the return isn't as good. When we actually disaggregate our ROI analysis on, which types of fundraisers are working on which types of gifts, of course, major gifts is crushing it all day long. Mid-level annual giving, you're not getting as great a return, but it's still a good return. So ultimately, it comes down to being able to make those kinds of cases. Hopefully that answers the question. That's the best I can do today. Here, thanks.
Would you like me to give you the next one too?
Sure, I'm good.
Okay, cool.
Until Jay decides to cede control back from me.
Yeah. The next one's from Chandra. It's, I understand not using grants for university ROI, but what about nonprofits for whom they are more than 30% of annual income?
Great question. For us, it was, I think it could go either way. Like, we could have used it in our case. The part of the issue with us was that the grants program wasn't necessarily fully integrated with the rest of advancement. So if you're in a program where that's part of the picture, where you're going, our major gift team is actually, getting the introductions to grants, or there are other players in there, then I'm going, those are integrated and they're connected in a way that you would definitely want to include those in your ROI analysis. I don't think it necessarily breaks down to university versus other nonprofits. It really matters in terms of the context of your situation. For us, it was separated enough where we go, yeah, that's just one guy doing his thing. He's not, he's not siloed necessarily, but it wasn't a part of the fundraising ecosystem in as integrated a way as it could have been, right? And so for us in that context, it just made sense to say we're going to leave those out because for this particular case. And I also, those can be some really big gifts, right? If I really wanted to push on the gas of saying, hey, we're getting a great return here, we could have been called out on, you're including, grants in there, you're padding your numbers, kind of thing. I wanted to take that out of the equation so that our analysis couldn't be sort of questioned in that way, which I don't know, maybe I'm too worst case scenario and too like, they're going to say this and that'll be bad. We maybe could have included it, but at least from just a functional perspective in terms of how we operated, it was, yeah, we don't need to include the grants in our ROI analysis. But if that's part of, if you're going, no, this is a bit more integrated than that, it takes multiple staff members, it's part of how we're saying, part of our investment in this broader fundraising ecosystem, then yeah, I'm going, yeah, you probably want to include that. Just be aware of the volatility of grants, right? Some of those can be quite large and can, really sway from one year to the next, right? So if you've got years where the ROI doesn't look great or it's not as good because of those swings, that's something you want to be able to account for. That was the other piece where I was like, I don't want to deal with it because it's going to be too, then we get into, oh, we've got the COVID money grants. Do we include those in this analysis? And like, no, we don't. That's not how we see it. So.
Jack, thanks for stepping in. As you can see, one of my cameras is working again. And this is a riff on kind of that same theme, although there's a slightly different angle to it from Stephanie. Great question. Who had said earlier that if you didn't answer this in the content of the talk, that you might want to see if you could talk about how you project campaign goals for non-individuals. So, foundation, corporate, et cetera, not just the grants. Any thoughts on that?
I am huge, I'm very biased because I spent a lot of my career in prospect management, right? And so a lot of the work that we're doing there is looking at the pipeline of what do we actually have conversations about, what's actually been asked for, what are the pieces that we're approaching and ask, and it really does come down to like each of the separate asks, right? So when I get into a campaign and we're looking at that space, like that's kind of where I'm going with that, and saying, this is as close as we can get to good numbers is going, we're going to tally up each of these different pieces here. And a prospect management system is the tool to do that, right? Where you're going, all right, who do you got? Where are you in that conversation? And then we're able to, when you have large enough groups too, you can start doing yields on that and say, oh, we generally know that about, 40% of these are going to come in, or anything past this point is more like an 80% close rate. We can understand that and be able to project a little bit. Backing up from that, though, if we're starting a campaign and saying, how much of this is going to come from, institutional funders, that can be really tough. And I don't have a good answer for it. And in fact, I go, as you're doing that, like that may be one of the error bars that you're looking at for your total. When we were doing our analysis, we were kind of leaving institutional funders out of it in any sort of like explicit way. They were kind of rolled in the sense of, this is generally what our prospect base looks like, and very rough, kind of putting our thumb at it and looking at it, this is what we think could happen. If we had really wanted to dig in more and had more time to work on it and look at it, we could have said, all right, we can see our way to X million with our existing individual prospects. And then there's a bar above that may kind of fade out as we get further, or maybe there's dotted lines on it saying, well, we're kind of in the range of here to here. The problem is, if you're early enough in the planning, you just don't know, right? Like, there's a reason why prospect management is great, because you're, as you get closer to an ask or you're in an ask, you get a better feel for those. But you're too far out, that can be really difficult. So I think that's a really tough part of campaign planning. That it kind of comes down to like doing an honest assessment of what have we been able to do historically and what's legitimate in that space. And also, if we were to lean into another, put more investment into that and say, let's hire another grant writer who can focus on this area, that could be a way to get at it. But I think ultimately that's a very difficult question that I think there's a lot of ambiguity and can be a little crazy. So sorry to not give like a very quick, easy answer.
It's a hard question, and there are more hard questions. So we had a couple, Andrea, that are really interesting. One is about the relationship between a 3-year gift versus a campaign goal, and is that you talked a lot about these campaigns, but I think those were completed campaigns. So what about for schools that didn't meet their goal? Was that a factor as you produced that analysis?
Wow, brilliant. So that was kind of taken out of the equation. The question there was more starting from the assumption that they're going to meet their goals, right? That's where we go. We're just going to assume that. And you'll see when, the trellis chart actually shows there's plenty of campaigns in there where they were in the midst of it. They were still in the campaign. They hadn't completed. In fact, most of the organizations that were included in that analysis had either, they're in the middle of their campaign or they just started. There's only a handful that had completed. And so from my point of view on that, I'm more interested in like where they're setting their sights, assuming that they've got good campaign counsel, they've done a lot of math on it, they're working towards it, and keeping the assumption that people they generally finish within their time frame. And so that was the piece that I kind of ignored the question of whether or not they finished. Some of it had to do with just the fact that I wasn't going to be able to get a big enough data set of completed campaigns. What I had available to me at that time was really just, here's all the campaigns that are open. The source for that, for the campaign goal amount, came from Inside Higher Education. At one point, they had a campaigns page that was just listing all of them, and I was able to just pull all of it. They've since taken that down, but thank you to the Internet Archive, or the Wayback Machine at archive.org. You can actually go and look at the very last iteration of that particular page and pull the data from there if you want to figure it out. So.
I wonder why they took that down. That thing was really useful.
Yeah, it was great.
Well, now we'll just have to rely on your data, since you're the Wayback.
Yeah, the Wayback. There you go.
And then there was a kind of a follow-on question from Andrea about wondering if you looked at optimal campaign length. So one of the other factors is, because campaigns like the one you talked about with one of your own institutions, some of these things are 5 years, some of them are 10 years. So what did you draw any kind of conclusions from the analysis you did about optimal length?
That's a really fantastic question. This was another piece that, in the course of the analysis, I'm like, this is interesting. I didn't have time to dig into it. And actually in the, looking at comparable schools tab of the Tableau file, you can look at that and see some of the data in terms of how long different campaigns are. In terms of an optimal length, who knows? I think there's a bigger question in there of what are the general trends around campaigns within higher education, especially in the context of this conversation. And even at that time, there were some cases that they piqued my interest, right? Because plenty of them are in that 5 to 8 year range length. Or if you're going, let's drag on till we complete it, and it's 14-ish years, that's the other way to it. McAllister College in St. Paul, just down the street from Hamlin, actually. At the time when I was doing that analysis, they were in the midst of a comprehensive campaign that they were calling the McAllister Moment, which was a very short campaign of 2-3 years, very short. And so they were, strategically coming at this from the perspective of we're gonna do this campaign type approach, but it's not going to be the gigantic, full-on thing, because I think to some extent, a lot of us are getting tired of the whole you're either in a campaign, preparing a campaign, or finishing a campaign, and at some point, and some of the volunteers I was working with, they were saying, what's the point? Didn't we just do this? And what's going on here? And what are we really going for? So there is an interesting question in terms of what is the optimal length? What makes sense for institutions? What makes sense for constituencies? And what they're going to, do we have donor fatigue in those spaces? I mean, personally, I'm let's see if we can do smaller, shorter, whatever, the whole comprehensive 8-year model. I don't know. But great question. And now I'm if I have any free time this weekend, I'm I should look at that and see what happened.
That's our idea. Just put you to more work. Well,
great, thanks. My wife will love it.
Well, one of the things about this is that campaigns for smaller institutions can often be shorter. I mean, at least that's been my experience. Maybe it's changing now. Versus higher ed, those goals are really huge. You work over a longer trajectory. And we had a question from Katie, and maybe this is a good kind of wrap-up question for those in the audience. who are at smaller institutions or have fewer resources, especially human resources, to do this kind of data analysis. And Katie said, we're a smaller organization, 25 staff. We don't have the capacity to do all this, as she termed it, lovely data analysis. What would you recommend as the top data points to prioritize?
Wow. I mean, which of my children is my favorite? I mean, that's a question. No, you know, I think when I'm looking at fundraising and how we're doing, like the key thing, you know, of course, is how much are we raising? And then when we're looking at sustainability, how are we doing with retention and at which levels, right? So paying attention to how many donors do we have at each of these different levels? Where are the declines happening? And being able to focus energy and attention there. That's the type of thing, like with a little bit of work, you can, you know, get that figured out. It's not, you know, and you know, I'm not to make light of, you know, the difficulty of like working with data, right? To say, oh, it's pretty easy, because it can be a bit much. But if I'm going to go, here's the 2 or 3 things I'm going to try and measure or get at. Those are the pieces: is total raised, what's that looking like, and then who is it coming from, and paying attention to that, because, you know, the last thing you want to do is look at a bunch of data and go, I don't know where to go with this, what to do with it. But when you're looking at it through the lens of who's staying on, who do we need to keep, where do we need to put our attention, just understanding like who those people are who are at the higher end, at the mid end, right? And saying that's where we can make a difference and retain those gifts and make sure that we know what's going on there. If you don't know what the problem is or where the issue is, you can't solve it, right? Like, oh, numbers are going down. But we have to understand where that is and where we can actually make a difference. Understanding the context behind your fundraising totals really, really matters. I mean, I've been in situations where people said, oh yeah, we're going to come in at, you know, 5 million this year, right? Because we did 4 last year. It's like, no, because half of that 4 was this, you know, estate gift that came in. That, you know, no, we can't just count on that again, right? Understanding that piece, how much is coming in, who's it coming from, what's the nature of that money, and whether or not it's repeatable, you have control over that. Just getting into that level is that'll get you a long way, right? Like just that's kind of 101 in terms of understanding your business in the fundraising space and working with that. I don't know.
And I realized I did miss something here that came in from Carrick in the chat earlier, and we want to make sure we have his voice in here, especially because this question actually follows on brilliantly to what we just were talking about, which is about the talent crisis, which I hear about in every single conversation everywhere. And he's tying this to the budgetary considerations that you had through this data. He asked if you have any thoughts about how you might spin this feasibility analysis to focus on adding PD positions as well as frontline fundraiser positions. So how can we take this data and say, this is why we need people to do this work?
Carrick, I don't like it. Yeah, I mean, I think there's always a way to be able to, you know, I don't like the word spin necessarily, but the honesty of looking at the data and saying, well, what's happening in this situation versus that situation, and using the data to help us understand that and put that, prove that point. You know, honestly, I having been in the AVP role, I have a hard time, you know, if I'm going to be really honest, I'm going, because we had to make these decisions. If we have a little extra money, where's that going to go? And there's times when I've had to say it's not going to go into prospect development because that's not, you know, where we're going to get the biggest return in this particular situation, which I hate saying, right? But it really comes down to the honesty of like, what do we need? Are we right sized? Is that, you know, and being able to say, yes, we do have to invest in prospect research. And in fact, if we don't, how long can we go without that, right? Research is just a hard one to do because, you know, we're in the back office. We're not necessarily like making the dollars come in right now, but being able to say, look, these people, this researcher identified X amount of money, and that yielded these results for us. This position matters, right? And so some of it comes back to like making sure that we're tracking that on the research side, on the analytics side, saying, hey, here's what the value was in terms of capacity. Now, if our fundraising team, you know, does their thing, which we know they can do, they're going to crush that, and we're going to see that capacity, you know, come through for us essentially. It all goes back to money. It all goes back to like what's the return. It all goes back to, you know, how do we take this information and position it in a way that shows, you know, yeah, this is valuable for us. And the honest thing is sometimes research isn't going to be the best investment at a particular point in time. And in fact, we were in that situation at Hamlin. We had to make some cuts, and we said, we're going to have to cut this research stuff. And I said, we can get by with that for right now. We're going to have some sort of research somehow, but we had enough for that point in time. And so, like, okay, this is a really tough decision, but we can do this right now. And if we don't take action later to reinvest in it at the right time, we will pay dearly for that. So we have to keep that in mind. And so that was part of the consideration as well. But that was a case where we said, right now, this is the decision we have to make. And that's just, you know, that's the way numbers work, right? Sometimes they just don't lie, or they're hard to ignore. But yes, we need to keep investing in this space. I'm a firm believer in the importance of fundraising intelligence. Like, you have to have that to be able to make smart decisions, because can't ask everyone for $1 million.
And I was just going to ask you, if people want to learn more from you and follow some of the things that you're doing, how can they do that? And we had Liz in the chat already say this is how to reach you, but I want you to be able to say it verbally for those who watch this as a recording. So how can people find out more about your work and reach out to you and learn more from you? I
have a slide for that, Jay.
Perfect.
People, feel free to, email me, mark@icastapartners.com. I'm on LinkedIn. There is another Mark Eggy out there who does data stuff. He is not me. Don't be deceived. He's in Montana and deals with city zoning stuff. So beware. The real deal is at linkedin.com/IM/MEGGE. And I mentioned my website before, icastapartners.com. So that's, I can nerd out about the stuff all day. I'm kind of like, maybe we should extend this. Jay, you want to hang out? You want to keep talking?
Right. Right.
It's so fun. So I really appreciate the chance to talk about this. Happy to talk with anyone who is interested in that kind of conversation.
Thank you, Mark. It'd be great to have you come back and do this again, because obviously there's a lot of demand for it, and both for the information as well as the comedy. With one of the other comments here, I'm just going to pass that along. So when you get ready for stand-up, you have a built-in audience. Thank you so much, Mark, for all of this today. We really do appreciate you. And as you can see, once again in the chat, if you're here live with us, you can just click that link and you can find Mark. And I do urge you to follow him both on LinkedIn as well as check out his website and see his analysis out there. He's shared a lot with us today, and there's more to share. If you are, again, here live with us, you'll find that there's an email coming to you. That email will include a link to the slide deck as well as to the Tableau. So please do open that email. And if you don't see it, that means it's probably gone to spam. And if you don't get these announcements about sessions like this one, I hope you'll sign up for it on the list DonorSearch, which you can find right at the top of the DonorSearch page at donorsearch.net, as well as recordings of all these sessions, including this one, over on the DonorSearch page under the Resources tab, and over at the DonorSearch YouTube channel, where there are dozens of these recordings. So you'll find all of that. But what you won't see right away is that we have stuff coming up right in the next few days, including, you do not want to miss this, Debbie Thomas, who's the global leader of nonprofit community capacity at Microsoft Philanthropies. If you ever wanted an insight as to what's going on there and what people are thinking about, you do not want to miss that. That is going to be next Tuesday, September 12th, 2023, in case you're viewing this in the future, at 3:30 p.m. Eastern. And then we also have a conversation with the great Betsy Chapin-Taylor, who's the CEO of Accordant. That's going to be on Wednesday. And then more sessions next week and the week after. So do follow all that over at donorsearch.net. And again, our thanks to the great Mark Eggy for the session today. Our thanks to all of you for hanging out with us and such great questions. And we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, take care.